Sun's already breaking through the trees this morning, same as it has been these last few episodes. There's a phrase in this chapter that sounds almost aggressive out of context, and the first time I read it, I wasn't sure it belonged anywhere near a channel built around quiet, honest mornings in a forest. Taking souls. It comes from the brutal week of training this chapter is centered on, the week designed specifically to break people, where the instructor's whole strategy is to make quitting feel like the only reasonable option available. Goggins' response to that pressure was to turn it into something else entirely, a mental game built around outlasting the people around him, using every person who gave up as fuel to keep going himself, treating survival itself as a kind of quiet, private competition. I want to spend this whole episode figuring out what that idea actually has to offer someone who's never been anywhere near a training pipeline like that, running alone with no instructors screaming, no visible competitors to outlast in real time. Because underneath the intense, combative language, I think there's a genuinely useful mental mechanism here, one that doesn't require anyone else's suffering to work once it's been translated properly. Let me say plainly, before going any further, that this episode sits a little differently than the last three. The language in this chapter is sharper, more combative, more openly about competition and pressure than anything covered so far in either book. I'm not going to soften that away entirely, because the underlying mechanism is genuinely useful. But I'm going to be careful about exactly what gets kept and what gets left behind in the translation, especially given how much of this channel's tone up to now has leaned quiet and patient rather than combative. This one's going to sound a little different on purpose, and I want that shift to feel intentional rather than jarring. Here's the shape of what actually happened in that week the book describes. Extreme cold, extreme exhaustion, sleep deprivation stacked on top of physical demands most people would consider unreasonable even once rested. The instructor's entire job was to make quitting feel rational, and it worked on plenty of people, understandably, because the suffering was genuinely severe rather than exaggerated for effect. What Goggins describes doing in the middle of that was noticing every person who quit and converting that observation into something personal, a mental tally, a private, almost competitive accounting of who was still standing and who wasn't, using the other person's decision to stop as evidence that he could keep going, that whatever was breaking them wasn't yet enough to break him. The mechanism underneath that language, stripped of the specific and genuinely brutal context it came from, is this: suffering becomes more bearable the moment it gets converted from raw, undifferentiated pain into a specific mental structure, a game, a comparison, a private scoreboard that give the mind something to actually do with the discomfort instead of just absorbing it directly. That reframe is the actual insight worth carrying forward here, not the specific combative language wrapped around it in that particular chapter. I think this is worth dwelling on for a second before moving to the translation, because it's easy to read this chapter and come away thinking the lesson is simply compete harder or use anger as motivation, which misses what's actually happening underneath the surface. The instructors in that story weren't just applying physical stress. They were applying psychological pressure specifically designed to make the suffering feel meaningless, arbitrary, without direction. The genius of the response wasn't toughness in some generic sense. It was refusing to let the suffering stay meaningless, actively assigning it a structure and a direction the instructors never intended it to have. I want to be careful and specific about the translation, because a solo runner doesn't have visible competitors quitting in real time, and pretending otherwise would just be borrowing intensity without doing the actual work of adapting it honestly. There are, I think, 3 versions of this reframe that actually apply to what this channel has been built around, and none of them require watching anyone else suffer to work. The first version is the most direct translation available, and it connects straight back to something from the last episode. Every person who's ever told you a goal was unrealistic, every doubt you've absorbed from someone else's honest, well-meaning assessment, is a version of the instructor in that story, applying pressure that's supposed to make quitting feel reasonable. The mental move isn't resentment toward those people, most of whom, like the doctor from last episode, were being genuinely honest rather than cruel. It's converting their doubt into a specific, private measure. Every hard mile completed is evidence weighed directly against that doubt. Not to prove anyone wrong out of spite, but because the doubt itself becomes fuel the moment it's treated as a comparison point instead of a verdict. Asterisk, asterisk. I've used a version of this on specific mornings where motivation was genuinely low, thinking directly about that conversation in the doctor's office. Not with anger, but almost like checking a private scoreboard. That specific assessment said this pace probably wasn't realistic. Today's run is either evidence for that assessment or evidence against it. And today, right now, I get to decide which. That mental frame did something a purely internal pep talk never quite managed on its own. It gave the discomfort a specific direction to point in, rather than leaving it as just raw, undirected difficulty to be endured. What made that particular reframe work, specifically, was how narrow and bounded it stayed. It wasn't a general sense of proving the world wrong. It was one specific conversation, one specific assessment, held in mind for one specific difficult mile, and then set back down once that mile was finished. That narrowness is what kept it from curdling into something bigger and less healthy, a permanent grudge against an entire category of skeptics rather than a temporary tool aimed at a single, specific, remembered moment. The second version doesn't need anyone else at all, which matters given how much of this channel has been built around running completely alone. The souls available to outlast don't have to be other people. They could be past versions of yourself, specifically the versions that quit, the mornings across this channel's entire history, where the honest sentence was, I decided not to run. Every one of those past decisions is sitting there, available as a comparison point, the same way another person's quitting is available in the book's version of this idea. Today's run, held up against a specific past morning that ended in surrender, becomes its own private, quiet contest, not against another person's body, but against an earlier version of your own will. This version carries a specific weight for anyone who's been honest. The way this channel has tried to be from the very first episode, about years of stopped and started attempts before any of this actually stuck. Those years aren't just a source of shame to be quietly carried. They're a specific, enormous collection of souls available to outlast, a private roster of every morning the old version of you decided the discomfort wasn't worth it. Each one available as fuel for a morning where the current version of you decides differently. That reframe changes what the whole history of past failure is actually for. It stops being just an embarrassing record and becomes raw material for exactly the kind of mental game this chapter is describing. There's something almost generous about this particular version. Once it actually gets used a few times, that surprised me the first time I noticed it. Every past version of yourself that quit isn't an enemy in this frame, and it isn't a source of shame either. It's more like a teammate from an earlier season, someone who genuinely tried and came up short under conditions that current you now has more tools to handle. Outlasting that version doesn't require resenting it. It just requires noticing, honestly, that today's version has something they didn't have yet, and using that gap as the fuel this whole chapter is describing. I think that reframe, more than the doubt-based version, is actually the gentler and more sustainable of the two, worth leaning on more often if a choice has to be made between them. Resentment aimed outward, even the careful, bounded kind described earlier, still requires holding another person's words in mind, which carries some residual risk of drifting towards something less healthy over time. Competing against an earlier version of yourself carries almost none of that risk because there's no other person involved to accidentally resent. Just an honest, structural comparison between 2 points on the same continuous timeline, both of them new. The third version is more abstract, but I think it's actually the one doing the most work underneath the other two, and it's worth naming directly because it's the actual mechanism rather than just another category of application. Turning raw suffering into a structured game works because games have rules, scores, and a sense of progress attached to them, all of which the mind can actually hold on to, where undifferentiated pain offers nothing to hold on to at all. A mile that's just painful is difficult to sustain attention through. A mile that's the fourth data point in a private contest against a specific doubter, or the 12th entry in a tally against past versions of yourself who quit, has structure, and structure is dramatically easier for a tired mind to keep engaging within pain alone ever is. I want to spend a moment on why this actually works mechanically rather than just asserting that it does, because I think understanding the mechanism makes it far more usable than just borrowing the language on faith. Suffering that has no structure attached to it tends to expand to fill the entire field of attention, becoming the only thing a tired mind is left to process. Suffering that's been converted into a specific comparison, a scoreboard, a private contest, gives that same tired mind an actual task to perform, tracking the score, noticing the count, checking the tally, which competes for the same limited attention the raw pain would otherwise consume entirely on its own. The pain doesn't actually decrease. What decreases is how much of the available attention it gets to occupy uncontested. There's a specific parallel worth drawing to something covered a few episodes into the last book, the idea that a simple plan survives fatigue better than a complicated one, because it asks less of a mind that has less to give. This mental game works through almost the opposite mechanism, but toward the same end. Instead of simplifying the task down to nothing, it gives the mind a specific, engaging structure to occupy itself with, one that happens to be more interesting and more sustainable than sitting directly inside raw discomfort with nothing else to focus on. Both approaches, radical simplicity and structure competition, are really just different tools for managing the same limited resource, a tired mind's capacity to keep functioning under real difficulty. There's a boundary worth being extremely precise about here, because this chapter's language, taken at face value and applied without real care, can tip into something genuinely unhealthy, especially stretched across the kind of long, sustainable project this channel has always tried to be rather than a single intense week. Using doubt or past failure as structured fuel is not the same as cultivating ongoing resentment, bitterness, or a hostile relationship with the people who've offered honest, well-meaning assessments along the way. The doctor from last episode wasn't an enemy. Using that conversation as a private scoreboard works precisely because it stays private, structural, and specific to a single mile or a single morning, not because it gets carried around as an ongoing grudge that colors an entire relationship or an entire outlook on other people. This distinction matters enormously for something built around long-term sustainability rather than a single week of extreme suffering designed to break people quickly. The book's original context was 7 days of the most extreme physical and mental stress most humans will ever voluntarily choose to face, a genuinely temporary, bounded ordeal. A year-long project, meant to continue indefinitely, cannot run on the same fuel a single week of extreme suffering runs on, and trying to sustain constant resentment or a permanent chip on the shoulder across months and years is exactly the kind of thing that produces burnout rather than durable discipline. The reframe here needs to be used the way a specific tool gets picked up for a specific hard mile, not worn as a permanent emotional posture carried through every ordinary morning regardless of whether that particular morning actually needs it. I want to be honest about a specific risk I noticed in myself the first few times I actually used this tool, because I think naming it plainly is more useful than pretending the boundary is easy to hold. There was a real pull, after the doubt-based version worked well on one particularly hard morning, to reach for it again the next day, and the day after that, treating every run as another round in the same ongoing contest rather than reserving it for the mornings that genuinely needed it. What that produced, within about a week, wasn't sustained motivation. It was a low, persistent hum of low-grade defensiveness that had nothing to do with running and everything to do with an old conversation that had already done its job days earlier. Setting the tool back down deliberately after it served its purpose turned out to matter just as much as picking it up in the first place. Looking back at that week now, what strikes me most is how invisible the shift felt while it was happening. Nothing about it announced itself as a problem. Each individual morning of reaching for the scoreboard again felt exactly as reasonable as the first one had, which is precisely what makes this particular tool riskier than the quieter ones covered earlier in this series. A simple plan or an honest accounting rarely curdles into something unhealthy through overuse. This one genuinely can, and the only real defense against that is the deliberate check covered a moment ago, asking honestly whether the difficulty in front of you is actually the kind this tool was built for, rather than reaching for it automatically because it worked once. I think this is the real skill this chapter is quietly teaching once it's been translated properly. Knowing when to reach for this specific mental tool on the mornings that are genuinely hard enough to need it, and setting it back down the rest of the time rather than running on it constantly as a default state. Most mornings on this channel haven't needed this kind of reframe at all. They've needed the quieter ideas from earlier episodes, honest accounting, simple plans, decisive action under uncertainty. This particular tool is for the specific mornings where none of those quieter ideas are quite enough on their own, where the difficulty is severe enough that the mind genuinely needs something structured to hold on to rather than facing raw discomfort directly. I want to walk through what actually applying this looks like in practice, because both versions, the external doubt and the past self-comparison, deserve something concrete to translate into. For the external version, the doubt-based scoreboard, identify one specific, honest assessment someone gave you, not a vague sense that people doubt you in general, the actual conversation, the actual words held clearly in mind. On a morning that's genuinely difficult, not every morning, just the ones that actually call for this, hold that specific assessment up against the run itself, treating the run as direct evidence weighed against it. Not with anger toward the person who said it, with the same quiet, structural focus this chapter describes, a private tally, nothing more theatrical than that. For the internal version, the past self-comparison, keep a specific, honest list of the mornings you didn't show up, the actual dates or circumstances if you can remember them, not a vague sense of general inconsistency. On a hard morning, pick one specific entry from that list and treat today's run as a direct answer to that specific past decision, not self-punishment for the old failure. A structured contest against it, using the same mechanism the book describes, just aimed inward instead of outward. I want to add a specific note about how to tell, in the moment, whether a given morning actually calls for this tool rather than one of the quieter approaches this channel has built up over the last several months. The test is fairly simple. If a normal, honest sentence about the difficulty, said plainly to yourself, is enough to get moving, that's an ordinary morning, and the quieter tools are the right ones to reach for. If that same honest sentence isn't landing, if the difficulty feels closer to what this chapter describes, genuinely severe, the kind where quitting starts to feel like the only reasonable option rather than just an easy one, that's the specific signal this heavier tool exists for. I'll add one final piece of guidance, because this is the sharpest edged idea this channel has covered so far, and it deserves real care in how it gets picked up. Reserve this specific tool for the mornings that genuinely need it, the ones where the difficulty is severe enough that quieter approaches aren't holding. Using it every single day, turning every ordinary run into a battle against doubt or past failure, risks exactly the burnout this chapter's original context never had to worry about, because that original context only ever had to sustain itself for 7 extreme days, not for a year, and not for whatever comes after this year either. Tomorrow morning, if the difficulty is ordinary reach for the quieter tools this channel has spent its whole history building. If the difficulty is genuinely severe, the kind that makes quitting feel like the only reasonable option, this is the tool built for exactly that morning. A scoreboard, a specific comparison, a mind given something structured to hold onto instead of raw pain with nothing to hold onto at all. I think it's worth naming, before closing this one out, why a chapter this intense earns a place in a series that's mostly stayed pretty measured and quiet up to this point. Not every idea worth having is a calm one. Some tools genuinely are sharper and more aggressive than the rest of the toolkit, built for a specific kind of severe difficulty that the gentler ideas simply weren't designed to handle. Pretending every hard morning can be solved with the same quiet, patient approach would be its own kind of dishonesty, the same kind this whole series has tried to avoid from the very first episode. Some mornings need patience. Some mornings need a private scoreboard and a willingness to treat the difficulty as something to be defeated rather than gently accommodated. Knowing which morning is which, and reaching for the right tool rather than defaulting to whichever one feels most comfortable is its own kind of honest accounting, not so different from the very first idea this whole project started with. There's a reason this chapter's title stuck with me longer than I expected it to, once the translation actually settled. Taking Souls, in its original context, was never really about anyone else at all, not fundamentally. It was about refusing to let external pressure, whether from instructors or doubters or an old, tired version of yourself, get to decide the outcome of a given morning without a fight. That refusal, stripped all the way down, is the same refusal this entire channel has been built around since the very first dark morning at a door, just wearing a sharper, more combative costume for the specific kind of morning that actually calls for it. I'll see you on the trail tomorrow. Same time, same choice, and on the hard mornings, a private tally running quietly underneath it. This is Run to Evolve. One day, one run, one lesson, no excuses.